Hello everyone and welcome to The Wild Side. This is your host Kight, and this week we are going to be talking about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. And to start us off, that was G-Riff playing the song Modify. And this is a topic that I'm covering this week because it was a request from a fan. I sent out a notice on the on the Source FM Facebook page asking for some feedback about scientific questions that you would like to have answered. And this is the first thing that popped up, and it's a really great idea, and so I'm devoting a whole show to it. And hopefully you will find this interesting and useful, and it will inspire you to let me know what other scientific questions you have so that I can start addressing those as well. Because it's really interesting for me to think about the kind of things that you guys are interested in, not just the topics that I kind of think about on a daily basis, because sometimes you'll suggest stuff that I wouldn't ordinarily read much about, and so I do learn a lot while I'm doing this. So this week I wanted to cover genetically modified organisms, not just because of a request from a fan, but also because I was recently sitting in a talk and I heard some very wise and learned people talking about genetically modified foods in kind of an uneducated sort of a way. And it's really depressing when you hear, highly educated people who have read lots of things still getting some of these concepts wrong. And so I think this is something that does kind of boggle the minds of lots of people, and they don't really know the basic science of genes and of reproduction, and so they can't quite wrap their minds around what does it mean to be genetically modified and what are the problems associated with this technique of producing food, but also what are the potential benefits of it. So to start off with, as always, I do want to have a bit of a definition period, because this is really, I think, the crux of a lot of the brouhaha over GMOs. You really do have to understand exactly what this term means. So when we're talking about genetically modified foods, we're thinking about foods that are produced from crops that have been genetically modified, or in some cases animals that have been genetically modified. And right now we don't have really many animals, certainly for food consumption, that have been genetically modified. So their meat is not on the market for us, but we do have lots and lots of crops that have been genetically modified, and their food is available for us to eat in the marketplace. And so this is really the thing that we're most focused on, is this produce that's being generated from crops that have undergone changes in a laboratory. And actually, if you think about it, the term genetic modification actually means a lot of different things, or could potentially mean different things, so it's actually quite vague. So sexual reproduction, for example, is a process that can cause genetic modifications. We take genes from multiple breeders and separate them and mix them up, and so then you get a whole new offspring that isn't like either of its parents, and that is a form of genetic modification. And during that process you'll also have chromosomes that will kind of get entangled with each other, and they'll accidentally swap bits of each other, and that can create whole new combinations of DNA as well. And so there's a couple of different modes associated with reproduction that can create genetic modifications. And this is usually not what's meant when we talk about GMOs, but this is something that certainly happens in the wild, and even in crops that are really heavily affected by human interference in the laboratory. So this can happen even to those as well. Another genetic modification is mutation, and this is caused by replication errors when the DNA is reproducing itself, if you like. And so there can be also damage to the DNA, so for example from radiation or from chemicals that cause mutations. You can have insertion and deletion of DNA into an organism's DNA, and this can be caused by something called mobile genetic elements, and these are bits of DNA that move around the genome, so they might come out of one little part of the DNA and then move down and go into another strand elsewhere, and then that will cause a change from one time point to another, and then that will carry on then when there is reproduction. And then also selective breeding is a huge and really important type of genetic modification, and we also call this artificial selection. And this is when you use breeding to create or enhance or reduce particular traits. And we're really familiar with this in a couple of contexts that I've actually already discussed in quite a bit of detail on the show in the past. So for example, dog breeds, which have morphological and personality traits that we have selected for on purpose over the years. Crops like sweet corn. So sweet corn is a type of maize that has really large kernels and very high sugar content. And this is actually something that is a naturally occurring mutation that was cultivated over time, and this started very early on, so that you could have, instead of a few plants that happened to be a bit sweeter and have larger, more succulent kernels, we can have a whole field grown of this type of corn because we've isolated those particular variants that have those traits, and then those are the only ones that we've bred time and again. We've also done this sort of thing with other plants where we'll hybridize them so that we can make sure that things have higher quality, they're less susceptible to disease, they're more resistant to certain traits in the environment. So we've done this basically from the beginning of agriculture, and we ourselves have been a selective impact on these types of plants and animals as well, I should mention. And you'll probably think that this is quite a familiar topic from to what I talked about previously when I was talking about humans as a selection pressure on a variety of different organisms and traits. And now finally, the thing I think that is probably most what we're talking about when we refer to GMOs, although we don't ever state this specifically, and so it's kind of hard to determine what is it that people are really addressing. But this is the idea of genetic engineering, and I think this is the thing that scares most people when they think about genetically modified food. And these are precise genetic manipulations that are performed in a laboratory, so you've got scientists in there kind of manipulating the DNA of a plant, which then can go on and manipulate how that plant looks or how it functions. And then once you've done that, you can take those plants that are produced and introduce them into a field setting and allow them to breed and produce the food that is finally shipped off to the store for us to eat, or to restaurants for us to eat as well. And so basically what's happening here is you're adding genes to a genome in order to give the plant, or again animal, although that's less common, a trait that it wouldn't otherwise have. And this is done often by using a biolistic particle delivery system, which sounds like a very futuristic sort of thing. You can shorthand this by calling it a gene gun. And what you've got here is something that can take a particle of heavy metal, so something like gold or silver, or some of the less valuable metals can be used as well. And you coat those with DNA in a form that will be received by the cell and taken up by that cell. And you then allow that cell to be impacted by the gene gun and by that little heavy metal particle, and it will incorporate that DNA into its own DNA strand, which is a really crazy process if you think about it. I really had no idea that this is how this was done. So what you do, I should say this is developed in the 1980s and was first used on onions, and now is used in lots of different species. So basically you take some plant cells and you grow them up on a petri dish, one of those little plastic dishes that you're always seeing pictures of online or in movies when you're in a lab environment. So you've got this little plastic dish, and you grow up the plant cells until they form something called a callus. And the callus is basically formed of the same cells that will grow if you injure a plant and it starts to kind of try to heal its own wound. So you get this little mass of cells, and that's a nice target for the gene gun. And you then shoot that little particle from the gene gun, and it will impact that little callus, and lots of the cells will die from the impact because that is a very violent interaction. But there's going to be a mass of cells, and it's usually kind of in an outer ring around that impact zone that they do survive, and that DNA that was coated on that metal, it will have gone into them, or at least touched them, and then they'll have taken it up, they'll have wrapped themselves around it and kind of sucked it up in, and then they'll incorporate that into their own genome. And once this is done, you've got these cells that have survived all of this violent process. The researchers will go in and collect those cells and allow them to kind of continue growing and reproducing, and at that point they'll likely differentiate. And by differentiate, I mean that they will turn into the types of cells that are specific to different parts of a plant. So some of the cells might be the stem, some of them might be the leaves, some of them might be various different parts that are used in different functions of the plant. So basically that means that you can take these precursor cells and grow up an entirely new plant after it has been treated with that added DNA. And hopefully what you're looking for, if you're working in the lab, is that the plant will have taken up that DNA and expressed it. And then theoretically it will not only contain the new gene, but then also show those new traits of interest, whether they are resistance to disease or the ability to survive really cold winters or something like that. And the same method, I should mention, is also being used or investigated for use in humans. So it might be a way that we could deliver vaccines, or if you're looking at certain medical treatments, we might be able to target certain cells in people without getting all the cells around them. So this is quite interesting in terms of medicine in general and human medicine in particular. Now, another way of adding genes to a cell is by introducing a bacterium known as Agrobacterium tumefaciens. And this is the agent that's responsible for something called crown gall disease. And this affects lots and lots of different species. And it kind of causes them to suffer irritation, and they kind of have a big immune response and swell up, and that's when they produce this gall, which you've probably seen at some point if you've ever gone for a walk in the woods. You'll have seen these plants that have the big swellings on them, or sometimes the swelling will drop off and you can just see them lying on the ground somewhere in the forest. So this bacterial agent does affect lots of different species, but in a natural setting, but then you can force it to affect species in a laboratorial setting. So you just take the bacterium and you introduce it and you let it infect these plants. And when you do that, you first take a small fragment of whatever DNA you're interested in and you stick it in the bacteria so that when you introduce those into the plants will then have that new DNA strain in them, and they'll likely pick it up and incorporate it in their own DNA. And that happens because the bacteria will often, they'll come apart and their own DNA will come out, and it will be floating around the cells of the plant, and those cells in the plant will pick them up and incorporate it into themselves. And so this is a nice way as well, maybe a little less violent in some respects, of introducing this DNA into the plants that you're interested in modifying. And then you can harvest that and again kind of go on to reproduce those plants and let them grow up with that new DNA within them. And one really early application of this particular method was to introduce the gene for firefly luminescence in order to create glowing plants. And as you would imagine, that's not the most useful of things, but it is a really striking demonstration that this is a technique that could work really well and allow you to introduce quite a wide variety of traits that are obviously not natural to those plants. So all those sorts of things we might be interested in sticking in and modifying the plants to work a bit differently. And this also is something that has been investigated for use in humans. So researchers have been able to successfully introduce genes into human cells in a laboratory, not within humans themselves, but cells growing in a dish. And that may actually scare more people than even the idea of a GMO in a plant, but it is potentially something that could be quite useful for combating diseases. So potentially introducing a gene that shuts off a cancer or shuts off some other kind of genetic mutation that is problematic in the human genome. So the basic idea is that whatever technique they use, scientists will introduce these genes or multiple genes that are working together in order to change how the plant is functioning. And you then have to ask for permission to really take it from there. So the researchers can grow up these plants that have been modified and collect the seeds from them in the hopes that they can use these new gene-containing seeds commercially. But they're not really allowed to do this until they perform safety tests and make sure that it's not going to have any negative repercussions on individuals or on ecosystems. They have to get permits to even take them out into the field to test them there. So until that permit comes through, they can only do examinations in a laboratory. And then they also have to go through a long process of getting additional permits after the product has been crop tested before they can then take those crops and put them into a market. So there are multiple points at which theoretically the people that kind of know whether or not these will be dangerous products will be able to put their foot down and say, no, you can't go any further with this. And at that point, let's say that everything does go successfully, and it has on many occasions in the past. There are lots of these crops in the store and on the market today. You can mass produce the seeds and sell them to farmers so that farmers can then generate the genetically modified crops, and they will not only contain that gene, but they'll also hopefully contain the activity of that gene, which will allow those plants to function differently than their natural predecessors and kind of work better, hopefully, in the field. And I guess this is probably a good point to just kind of reiterate exactly why I keep emphasizing not just the genes but also the functions. And that's because you have to remember that genes create amino acids when they're transcribed. And those amino acids work together to make proteins, and then proteins act in the body in some way in order to modify, how an organism behaves and kind of create everything about an organism, really. They're responsible for all the sorts of processes that go on inside a creature. And so theoretically, you could introduce a gene into a plant, and it would not create an amino acid properly because maybe there was a mistake with it. It might create an amino acid, but those don't form together to make a protein. The protein maybe is folded incorrectly so it can't function, or it produces a protein that's just not working very well with other proteins, and so the body gets rid of it naturally. So there actually are lots of processes going on here to make sure that, once that new DNA is introduced, it does finally come out and have an impact on the plant. There are probably lots of missteps along the way, so researchers will try lots and lots of things before they can ever get this to work, because there are many steps along the way where the plant might naturally stop things from progressing, or the DNA itself might not quite function very well. And so this is a very meticulous and time-consuming process. And it is highly possible that you could have plants out there with these genetic modifications that actually show no evidence of that whatsoever, because they aren't doing anything. There are no amino acids, there are no proteins, the proteins aren't acting, whatever the case might be. You can have an introduced gene and not actually have any real change to the plant itself. And that's just something that's kind of important to keep in mind when you're thinking, what do I think about GMOs? Are they dangerous? Are they not dangerous? What do they really mean? And in some cases, they may not actually have this new DNA may not actually have a huge impact on the plant. And so really all of this is just to say that genes can be suppressed in lots of different ways. They can be present and have no effect. And the objections that most people have to genetically modified food, they stem from the fact that you do often, for the most part, have these active genes that have been introduced that create new things that weren't there in the past in the plant. They create new traits that weren't present in a particular habitat. You can even use them to eventually create whole new species or varieties. And all of these things are kind of quote-unquote unnatural. And it's really hard to say, what is natural and what's not natural, because where do you start timing? Humans are unnatural in many environments, that here we are now. But the point is that we do go in and make these modifications to things that probably would never have happened normally, and that's where a lot of the objections come up. So I'll stop there, stop defining things and introducing things. We'll have a quick music break, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit more about what crops on the market today are GMOs, and what are the effects of those genetic modifications that have been made. That was Collide with the song Modify. And today on The Wild Side, we're talking about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. And the next thing I want to discuss is, what are the crops that we can find in our shops today that are GMOs, or tend to often be GMOs, and why? Why have these genes been introduced, and why have these plants been modified? Well, a large number of selective breeding efforts, so efforts where we're taking these plants and kind of letting them breed together naturally, if you like. We're not modifying them in the lab. These were aimed at making crops tastier and more abundant and hardier, so they could withstand different temperatures and pHs and things like that. GM crops tend not to focus on those sorts of things, partly because we've already done a lot of that in the past. Instead, they tend to be more focused on improving the yield. So for example, by making things more resistant to multiple types of pests and other environmental factors, and also just kind of figuring out other ways to basically get more money out of a crop. So having something that lasts longer when you're shipping it, or something that looks visually more appealing to people so that it's kind of the product that they want to buy. So I know that sounds a bit callous, but there is an element of just kind of thinking about the economics of agriculture when you think about GMOs. So the first genetically modified plant was produced in 1983, which is actually not that long ago if you think about it. I kind of assume this was happening for a much longer period of time. And the broad uses of GMOs are, of genetic modifications are pest resistance and herbicide resistance, and also a bit of disease resistance. So one example of pest resistance is Bt plants, and this is plants like potatoes and corn and cotton, and these all possess genes from a bacterium that's known as Bacillus thuringiensis, which I may be mispronouncing, so don't quote me on that. But Bt is how that is abbreviated, hence the name Bt plants. And this bacterium produces a toxin that can be used as a biological pesticide, and it's particularly good against insects that would come along and munch on the leaves of these plants. And so this bacterium, would just automatically produce this and kind of secrete it in order to keep things away from it and protect it whenever it's around these things in the environment. And so what you do is you take these genes and you put them in plants, and then plants will excrete that themselves, and it will cause the insects to leave them alone. And so obviously that means that if you've got insects that will come take a certain proportion of your crops every year, if you introduce these genes, then the insect issue is either completely solved or at least drastically reduced. Herbicide tolerance is kind of along the similar vein. So one example of this is bromoxynil-resistant cotton. And bromoxynil is a herbicide that kills weeds by preventing photosynthesis. And if you put the genes for resistance to this within plants, then you can treat a whole field of those plants and not worry about your crop of interest, but also at the same time be able to get rid of all the weeds that are growing around the base of that crop and kind of competing with it for nutrients and for space. So obviously you can think being able to produce these herbicide resistant things is quite useful for making sure that you can really encourage the plants that you do want while simultaneously getting rid of the plants that you don't. Now, disease resistance is good for making sure that plants are not going to be susceptible to things that are either a problem now or to things that you think might eventually become a problem in the future. And one great kind of case study of disease resistance, genes being introduced into plants, is the story of papayas from Hawaii. And these papayas began really suffering from something called the ring spot virus. And this was predicted in the 1990s to be on the verge of completely wiping out the entire Hawaiian papaya industry. And people were really panicked because they couldn't think of any kind of conventional or organic method to control this virus that was running rampant through papayas and really threatening them. And then someone worked out a way to introduce genes from something else to make them resistant to this virus. And this was a really successful thing, so they created this cultivar known as the sun-up papaya, and it now comprises about 80% of the entire Hawaiian market because there still is no method of controlling for the virus, organically or conventionally, and so this really is the only way in order to grow papayas on Hawaii and still have any industry that's not being affected by this virus. And this is actually quite similar in many ways to something that's currently happening in Florida, where, Florida and elsewhere in the U.S., but particularly in Florida, there is a huge proportion of the entire citrus industry, in particular the oranges, that are completely threatened by this kind of mysterious disease that's invaded. And I forget now whether it's a bacterium or a virus, but either way, it is really threatening a huge proportion of the crops, and it's causing millions of dollars of loss. And some people are saying it might actually eventually cause the entire industry to collapse there. And so I know that there's been a huge amount of money put into figuring out how we can make these oranges resistant to disease so that we could, genetically modify them and save the industry. And when you think about the number of jobs this involves, the huge economy, individual people, but also organizations and the entire state, you can really begin to understand why GM foods are kind of interest to people, because it does have a huge impact on social factors as well as on biology. Now, I mentioned earlier that intolerance to environmental conditions is also another factor of interest. So, for example, you might want to make plants that are cold tolerant or heat tolerant or tolerant to saline conditions, and all of these things are particularly important when you think about climate change and the fact that a lot of the habitats where plants are currently grown are going to shift over time as the weather conditions change. Tobacco is one example of something that has been modified. So researchers have taken the antifreeze gene from cold water fish and inserted it into tobacco and also potatoes and probably some other plants as well, but those are the big two crops. And now they're much more cold tolerant, so they can thrive in places where they would not ordinarily have thrived. Or you could start the growing season earlier, extend it later, and not worry about the extreme colds of early spring and late fall. Something else that's kind of interesting is the fact that these genetic modifications can also be used in very undeniably good situations. So some of those other things you might say, well, people are just out to get money, it's really all just about the market. But there are other ways where they can be very useful in a way that it really is beneficial to individual people and also to kind of society and the environment. So phytoremediation is a good example of this, where you take genes and put them into plants so that you can then use those plants to clean up problems in the environment. So for example, if you've got heavy metal pollution in an area and you need to decontaminate that soil, then you can take genes that allow you to do this and stick them in plants and plant those plants in that area, and they'll just pick up all the heavy metals. You harvest the plants, take them away, and the heavy metals are gone. And this sounds like something that's too good to be true, but it has actually already been done with poplar trees. So you take these heavy metal, I don't really know how to refer to it, sucking up genes basically, and I think they're probably from bacteria, because there are a lot of bacteria that can interact with these metals. So you take the genes out, put them in the plants, and these poplars then will suck up all of the heavy metals from the soil. You can cut the trees down and take them away, and then the soils are much cleaner. You can also introduce genes that help improve the nutritional value of plants. And this is really important, not just for people that already have access to lots of things to eat, but also for people who are quite deprived, and so maybe they only have one or two things that they can eat. So if you can make what they do have as nutritional as possible, it could be hugely beneficial. And the case study for this, the thing that's always touted as being, the example and the way to go, is the story of golden rice. And this is a product that was engineered so that it synthesizes beta-carotene, which is a precursor to vitamin A. And vitamin A is really important. It's estimated that every year about 500,000 children or more will die from having a deficiency of vitamin A, as well as other dietary problems as well. And so if you can take this rice and put the vitamin A in there, when these people grow the rice, and they would already have grown the rice, so this is theoretically for use in places like Asia and Africa, where you do often have rice anyway, you give them this type of rice instead of what they would have grown, and here they've got the vitamin A right in there without having access to any of the other produce that would have naturally added that. And this sounds like a really great idea, and it was heralded as groundbreaking when it first came out and as life-saving, but unfortunately it's encountered a lot of opposition because people are worried about the consumption of these genetically modified products. And so it still hasn't been very widely produced, and it still hasn't been rolled out internationally, and so it's just kind of sitting on the shelf, just waiting for something to maybe happen with it. But there are other plants that might eventually have this same sort of role. And conceivably that is quite a nice idea, assuming there aren't any side effects of having these genetically modified plants. Now, one of the really important considerations when you're trying to think about what is the effect of a GMO is how it's utilized. So some of these things are going to be eaten in their entirety. So the papayas that I mentioned, the rice that I mentioned, those would be consumed as they are. Other things are going to be highly processed. So for example, if you've got a genetically modified soybean, and soybeans are very common in that form, you will often extract oil from them. And when you extract the oil, you often will get rid of all, or quite a lot of, the DNA that produced the soybean to begin with. And if you don't have the DNA of the product, then is it really any different from a product that came from something that was not genetically modified? And that is kind of a moral or ethical question that we have to ask ourselves. And you also have to think about the use of GM organisms that are used to create secondary products that are then consumed. And a great example of this is the use of GM products in the production of cheese. So I talked a little bit about cheese production a while back, and I'll just remind you now that one of the things you have to introduce into a cheese mixture is rennet, which is a mixture of enzymes that are used for cheese coagulation. And these come originally from the gut of bovines, of calves. And so, it's hard to extract those. They're very costly. It's not easy to get your hands on them all the time. And it'd be really great if you could kind of cut that corner by just having something else instead. And in fact, you can take these rennet-producing genes and introduce them into other microorganisms, so you don't have to harvest anything from the gut of a calf. You can just put them into other bacteria, if you like, or fungi, or whatever little microorganism you want. And then you can utilize the resulting product that they make, something called chymosin, which is the key enzyme, and that will help you create your cheese. So in this case, you're using these microorganisms in place of the rennet-producing microorganisms you originally would have had, and you get the same product. After fermentation, the GM organism is killed, the chymosin is removed from the fermentation broth, and so the cheese that you end up with, it looks identical to traditional products, it tastes identical, and DNA tests can't even tell the difference between them. However, is that a problem if you're really against GM products? And that's going to probably vary from one person to the next. And another thing to think about is that some of these products are used to generate extracts that can then be used for a variety of purposes throughout the food industry. And there are a variety of examples of these. One good one is lecithin, which is an emulsifier that's made from corn and soy oil. That's really hard to say. Corn and soy oil. And these, as I mentioned earlier with the soybean, they contain very little or no protein or DNA. So the standing testing processes would not be capable most of the time of distinguishing between a GMO and a non-GMO derived product. So the lecithin that we get from the GM organisms looks exactly the same as the lecithin from quote-unquote natural things. Vegetable oil is a similar example. Also sugar, so for example from GM sugar beets, this looks very similar to the ordinary sugar, and that's because it's just a crystal. It doesn't have anything to do with DNA. It's a product that's non-organic by the time it's all processed. And then finally, I think the other thing that people tend to worry about is the use of GM products that are used to feed animals, and then those animals are sometimes then consumed by humans. So indirectly, we might be consuming some remnant of a GM product because of our consumption of those animals. So canola and soybeans and maize are all used to feed livestock, and then those livestock can be used for things like meat and milk and eggs that we would consume. And again, so far, all the genetic tests that we've created cannot really distinguish between GMO and non-GMO products. And the difference can usually just be spotted if you've got the feed that they're given and you do testing on that feed. Because obviously, the canola and the soybean and all those things themselves, those can look a bit different if you are looking for those genes that have been modified. But once that has been uptaken by the animal will process it and break it down in its stomach, and it ends up in the same format. Everything becomes just little particles that are used in other ways, and so there's no longer any evidence of whether something was GMO or non-GMO. And currently there are no genetically modified animals approved for direct use as food, which I kind of mentioned earlier. Salmon is maybe on the way. This has been really close to being confirmed since at least last fall, but there still has been no progress in actually coming up with a final determination to do this or not. But there are some modifications that have been made associated with the production of food. So we can modify cows, for instance, so that they will then produce the milk that we might consume. And also for non-food products. So there are some organisms that are manipulated so that they will produce things that we can use in drugs. And the really big question, and the reason why there is so much controversy, is that it's really hard to say whether all of these things are equal, whether they're dangerous, whether these highly purified derivatives have any problems with humans. Are they any different than the things that aren't derivatives? They're eaten in their natural form just after being harvested. What's the genetic heritage? What level of change do we accept or not accept? And all of these things tend to be decided by individual people rather than something that you can actually test scientifically, because it's kind of a gray area. That was GB3 with Modifier, and this is Caitlin Kight talking to you on Source FM's Wild Side, and today we're discussing genetically modified organisms. And before the break I was talking a little bit about why some of these genetic modifications were introduced and what the effects are, and now I want to think about where are the GMOs and how common are they? So as of last year, over 17 million different farmers in 28 countries were growing GM crops on a total of about 170 million hectares. So this is over 12% of all arable land. So that's actually a non-significant amount of time and money and space that is devoted to these genetically modified crops. And the U.S. produces more GM crops than any other country. You're very welcome. Regulators have okayed in the U.S. the commercial production of over 25 genetically modified crops. 85% of these are corn. I'm reading my own stat wrong. 85% of all corn is genetically modified, 91% of all soybeans are modified, and 88% of all cotton are modified in the U.S. So obviously this indicates that the majority of some crops are going to be genetically modified in the sense that they are manipulated in the laboratory with added genes and then taken out into the field. Other countries that have lots of GM crops include Brazil and Argentina, India and Canada, and all of these each have over 10 million hectares apiece devoted to the crops. And the crops that they mostly focus on are soybeans and maize and cotton. Now in Europe, GM plants comprise only a tiny fraction of all the crops produced. The only European countries that produce GM crops are Spain and Portugal, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Romania, Sweden, and Germany. And the crops that they produce are maize and potatoes. And outcries against GM have been much greater here in Europe than elsewhere in the world, and that's why you do see this trend. No genetically modified foods are grown in the UK, but they are imported, and the most common of these imports is soya, which is used in animal feed and also in some food products for humans. And there's actually a great website that tells you all about the regulation of GM in the UK. It's quite accessible, it's not just kind of government talk, and I will put a link to that on the Wildside webpage, which is woefully out of date and which I will be updating in the next couple of days. I'm very sorry if you've gone to look up the names of songs or to find out about stuff that I've mentioned on the show and have found nothing, so I will get on top of that. So before I kind of start to wrap up, and I have talked in a very circuitous fashion today, so I'm kind of racing against the clock here, I do want to address directly what all the fuss is about, or at least what I think all the fuss is about when it comes to GMOs. And one of the big scary things is that GMOs can allow the escape of these introduced genes into new species and also into new environments. So the organisms that have been modified can hybridize with wild-growing plants and then pass on their genes, and this can have potentially detrimental effects to species and also ecosystems, and these can be very hard to predict to begin with. So you could have all these side effects that you totally weren't expecting at all, which could have serious repercussions. You could have infection with bacteria and viruses that could allow organisms to inadvertently pass on genes. So even if they aren't hybridizing, this could still happen because these bacteria and viruses can pick up those genes and then take them to a new place once they then move to a new habitat or move to a new species. And gene escape is a particular fear for GM algae, which I mentioned before on the show. So people are really worried not just about food crops, but also things like biofuels and other sorts of genetically modified crops. Another problem is negative ecological effects in general. So if you change the genetic makeup of one organism, you might change how it works and how it has a function in an ecosystem, and that can have repercussions for the other organisms around it. So for example, Bt maize has been associated with increased biodiversity in agricultural fields because the growers will stop their general treatments. They don't need to worry about general discouragement of pests, and that allows lots of these pests to then survive when they otherwise wouldn't have, because they're no longer being targeted by these herbicides and these pesticides. But at the same time, Bt maize has also been associated with decreases in some organisms that rely on quote-unquote natural conditions. So insects will naturally create damage to crops, and there are certain types of other organisms that will come in and do really well when they're feeding on that decaying organic matter that's left by those attacking insects. So if Bt discourages those insects from having any action, then it will discourage those next round of insects from coming in and benefiting from that as well. So you can adjust the balance of what organisms are around in any particular place. And that can have serious repercussions for how the environment is actually working and functioning as a whole. Now, resistance has already been observed in some insects that have been exposed to Bt plants. So, for example, this was first observed in 2009 in bollworms in India, and then it has since been seen also in Australia and China and Spain and the US. And so Monsanto upped the ante by producing a whole new generation of GMO cotton that had multiple Bt proteins instead of just one protein. And so basically this is a great example of the kind of arms race that can result from the GM situation, where you're going to have organisms that will kind of adjust to the new setting, whether that's because you've got insects that are going to develop a resistance to the thing that's trying to harm them, or insects that will figure out how to overcome something. You'll have plants that maybe will naturally mutate so that they don't keep that gene that has been introduced, or whatever the case might be. It's not always going to stick and keep functioning the way that you want it to function, and then you're just going to have to keep doing more and more and stronger, and where is that finally going to go? It maybe could just keep on snowballing forever. And so we need to worry about how long the escalation will last and how far we're actually going to have to go in order to keep producing the food that we want. And of course, a lot of people are really worried about the potentially harmful effects to consumers. So far, a large number of scientific studies have overwhelmingly found time and again that GM crops do not pose any serious risks, or at least the risks that they pose are no greater than the risks associated with any other type of natural food. The few that have found potential patterns have been kind of criticized by a variety of people, not just people in the industry, for not being very well-designed studies, and so the results just can't be trusted and the studies need to be performed again. One major concern that might actually have some legitimacy is the idea of increased allergenicity. So the introduction of genes into crops might create new types of allergy. So for example, we know that lots of people are allergic to nuts, and so if you were to take a gene from a Brazil nut and put it into a soybean, which is something that was recently suggested, what would the repercussions be? Would you have people that are eating soybeans who suddenly then become ill because they're actually allergic to the Brazil nuts? And this could be quite obviously a serious problem for lots of people. Non-biologically, there are also some other issues. So GM foods cost a lot of money, and that money might be better spent elsewhere, and it could also drive up the price of food, so it could have lots of economic problems. If we are going to have GM foods, people want to know that they're eating those things that have been adjusted in some way, and so we need to work on the labeling. And this is one of the big things that has been done very well here in Europe and in the UK in particular, is that people are very aware of the need to label things so that consumers are aware of what they're purchasing and they know what's happened before that product has gotten to the market. Monsanto is kind of one of the huge reasons why everyone is so distrustful of the idea of GMOs, because it has all these issues associated with lobbying and poor labor practices, controlling farmers, acting as a monopoly. It's been involved in several major lawsuits, and also just generally being an unpleasant company. And so the activities of this one organization have really done a lot to kind of make people suspicious and make them really put their feet down on the whole idea of GMOs. And that may or may not be fair, because not all organizations are working with the same kind of MO as Monsanto, and some of them actually have the desire to help people out and to make things better, but they're kind of being tarnished by the activities of this one company. Now, I do just want to kind of close on the idea that GM crops have also been discussed as something that could potentially be quite helpful for all humans. So I've already mentioned the golden rice and the case of how certain GM crops could really be useful in terms of nutrition in areas where you might not get certain dietary requirements. But also, you know, in the case of climate change and human population growth and these increased burdens on our agricultural system and our food production system in general, GMO crops could be really useful because they could introduce the genes that we need to produce enough food for all the people that are on Earth, to produce food that comes from crops that grow in new locations, or to produce more crops in the locations that already exist. So whatever the case might be, it might just help us move on so that we can get the whole market saturated with everything that we need. Now, some people suggest that actually we don't need to do that, that we already have enough food products, that natural methods of farming are perfectly fine, and that is a very justifiable opinion. There's actually some great writing about that in the book Good Food for Everyone Forever by Colin Tudge. He argues that we don't need to worry about any of this big industry stuff, and that probably is a very good concern and a good viewpoint. But it is true that genetic modifications can allow you to combat changes in weather patterns and temperature and pH and nutrient levels and all of these things that could allow us to modify plants so that they can tolerate drought and flooding and extreme salinity and all sorts of problems that might increase as climate change goes on and as the human population grows. So we probably don't need these things, but they might also make it easier for us to deal with these problems, and it might also make it more lucrative for certain farmers to be in the business. And so that's just something that's kind of interesting to think about. And a great book that I read a couple of years ago is The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bastigalupi. And this is actually an award-winning science fiction book in which he kind of imagines this futuristic society where we've got all of these people who have done all these sorts of genetic modifications to crops, and they've undergone the population boom and the climate change, and he imagines what would the effects of this be. And in some cases they are good because everyone, they do have food still, and they've been able to adjust so that they can be resistant to insects and other diseases. But it's also not quite the same as it is now. In many ways it's very unpleasant. So it's really kind of a nice mind exercise if you want to think about, what do you think about GMOs and what could the repercussions be if we keep going down this road. So I will wind up for now. And I think that's quite enough talking for today. I hope that that was at least somewhat illuminating so that you kind of have a better idea of what GMOs are and where they can be found and whether or not they have implications for you and your diet. And I will be updating the Wildside webpage to put lots of links so that you can read about certain issues in more detail in the future. So for now I'm going to leave you in the hands of Modified singing Running Up That Hill, and I will talk to you next week.